Welcome to Chapter 2.4, our chapter on sculpture. Sculptures, what makes sculpture is that they're three-dimensional, as opposed to the other artworks that we have been looking at so far. Painting, drawings, film, these are all two-dimensional art forms. You can hear my dog snoring in the background, can't you? But sculptures can be made from anything, any material: glass, wax, ice, plastic, neon lights, animals. Sculptures are three-dimensional. They occupy physical space. We can walk around them or become immersed in an environment. Approaches to three dimensions in sculpture. Sculpture can be freestanding, or what's known as sculpture in the round. Then there's relief sculpture, which is the sculpture designed from viewing from one side. The image in a relief either protrudes or sunk into a surface. So freestanding sculpture is sculpture that can be viewed and experienced from all sides. So this is a freestanding sculpture. You can walk all the way around it. This is a freestanding sculpture. You can walk all the way around it and see it from multiple sides. Relief sculpture, though, however, projects from a surface or is cut into a surface. We've already learned these terms earlier, but we have what is known as bas relief, which means low in French. So it's a sculpture that is either cut into or projects just a small distance from the surface. Or we have high relief, which is when a sculptor chooses to carve more deeply. This creates what is known as high relief sculpture. It projects a considerable distance from the surface. So there's lots of different ways to make sculpture, but primarily we have what are known as subtractive and additive methods. So in subtractive method, a sculptor uses a tool to carve, drill, chisel, chip, whittle, or saw away unwanted material. In additive sculpture, this is made processes of modeling, casting, or constructing. So you add material to create the image. So carving. Most ancient works of art that still exist were made using subtractive methods. Most were made from stone or ivory or wood, worked by chipping, carving, sanding, or polishing. So if you look at the image on the left, this Hawaiian figure, this is made from wood that was carved, cut away to reveal the sculpture inside. This is a large head. This is about 5 feet, almost 6 feet tall. This comes from the Olmec culture located in Mexico, an ancient culture from Mexico who created over 100 of these massive heads. Some of them are up to 8 feet tall. These sculptures are fantastic to see in real life. They were made from a material called basalt, which is a fairly soft stone, but this was carved using Stone Age technologies, so stone on stone, basically. So in subtractive carving, a sculptor uses a tool to carve, drill, chip, chisel. So in this case, a stone was used. When we think of carving, we often think, of course, the great Renaissance artists, and in particular Michelangelo. You might be more familiar with Michelangelo and his painting, especially his ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. But really, it's his carving that he had a closer connection to. In fact, Michelangelo never really fancied himself a painter. He felt that carving was, in a way, more real. You're making something substantial, something three-dimensional. In fact, he believed that he wasn't actually doing the actual work, but instead God had embedded the sculpture inside the stone, and he was simply revealing what was already there. And this is evident in the way he carved. And we know how he carved because there are some unfinished Michelangelo sculptures. He was going to create a tomb for Pope Julius II, but they ran out of money. And this tomb was going to contain something like 30 sculpted figures, and some of those figures remained unfinished. But while this sucks for Michelangelo, it's great for us because we can now see his methods. Most sculptors tend to sculpt all the way around. So they would start from the front and the back, kind of moving inwards from the outside in. But Michelangelo is carving almost like he's freeing the structure or the figure inside. He would carve really just from one side, as if he was pulling away this material, revealing what God had embedded into the sculpture. This is an example of Moses from the tomb of Julius II, which ultimately was finished but on a much smaller scale. But this would have been carved in the same way that we saw the image of the bound slave figure sort of from one side, revealing the contents within. I'm going to have you guys now watch a video about carving, so go and watch that. Watch how the artist uses her tools and how she approaches the block of marble, and just in general the methods that she uses. Take a look at that video and then come back. Welcome back. Alright, so now we're moving from subtractive methods to additive methods, where additive processes the artist builds up the work by adding material. Some materials, such as clay or wax, require temporary skeletal structure for support, called an armature. When clay is dried and fired in a kiln, it becomes very hard and durable. So, a common material used for modeling is clay, because clay is soft. You can squish it with your hands, you can shape it, you can add clay on top of clay, creating a sculpture. This comes from the ancient Etruscans, an early culture located in Italy, and it is made from a soft clay called terracotta. But it was simply made in the same way that a child would make a clay structure out of Play-Doh or whatever, by manipulating it with your hands. Substitution is a form of what we call casting. Casting involves adding a liquid or a pliable material to a mold. So if you've ever poured water into an ice cube tray and then froze the water, you've technically made an ice sculpture. You have used a mold, you have cast a sculpture. But first, a model of the final sculpture is made. This is used to make a mold in which a casting liquid is poured. This is usually made out of clay. When it hardens, the result is a detailed replica of the original model. So I'm going to have you guys watch another video on casting. And you're going to see a method called the lost wax method of casting. This is used to make hollow metal sculptures. Traditionally in the ancient world, you would see the material bronze being used. So you're going to watch this video and you're going to see how these sculptors create this. And then you're going to come back and we're going to talk about this sculpture here. So go away, watch the video. Bye. All right, welcome back. So this is these are two sculptures in the lower left, two sculptures called the Riachi Warrior. We have a close-up over here on the right of Riachi Warrior A. These were made using the lost wax method. As you saw in the video, you saw just a video of a head being cast. And these sculptures would have been cast in pieces like that. I'm not exactly sure how many, but usually things like arms and legs were cast separately from torsos. This is a amazing sculpture. This comes from the ancient Greek world. When we think of ancient Greek sculpture, we generally think of white marble. But this is a rather fascinating sculpture because it's made of bronze. And actually the Greeks preferred bronze. But bronze doesn't last. It doesn't have the, not because it's not durable, but because it often gets melted down and reused to make other things like building materials and weapons and things like that. So a lot of ancient bronzes haven't survived simply because they've been reused for other things. But the Riachi Warrior survived because in 1972 a guy was diving off the coast of Italy, and he saw he saw a hand protruding from the floor of the ocean. And unlike me, who would have run across the surface of the water back to the beach, this guy investigates and keeps digging into the sand. And what he found was the result of a shipwreck. 2,500 years before, a boat carrying these Greek sculptures from Greece to Italy wrecked off the coast of a town in Italy called Riachi. And these two bronze sculptures sat at the bottom of the ocean for over 2,000 years, 2,500 years, and were rediscovered by this man on vacation. And they're not only incredibly rare because so many bronze sculptures, especially large-scale bronze sculptures from the ancient world, have not survived, but also they're important. Because they... Look, here I am. Hey, how's it going? They're also important because they're really intact. Oh, and there's my cat back there. Say hi to Noodle. So they're still intact, and this is really cool because even sculptures that have survived tend to be missing parts. You'll notice that this sculpture has eyes. These are inlays. I just lost everything. These are inlays. Made of either seashell or bone or ivory. And in most sculptures, these things have disappeared. They've either been lost or destroyed over the years. But those remain, and so does his teeth, if you could look up close here. He is missing some weapons, because the weapons would have been made with iron and wood, and both of those materials would have long ago sort of just disintegrated. But these are remarkable sculptures. The sculptures are standing in a pose typical of ancient Greek sculpture called contrapposto. And there's the spelling there on the screen. Contrapposto literally means counterbalance. But it was used by the ancient Greeks to give their sculptures a natural feeling. Instead of sort of standing stiff and upright, they have this S-curve to their body. One hip is higher than the other. You'll also notice that one half the body is sort of relaxed, and the other half, the elbows and the knees are bent. They're engaged. And this is meant to show the body in both states of sort of rest and motion. It also divides the body up in a harmonious way in 4 sort of equal quadrants, giving a sense of balance and beauty, which the Greeks were kind of obsessed with, balance and beauty and proportions. We've already talked about the golden mean, or the golden ratio, and this kind of goes in line with the Greeks' quest for perfection. It is also why the Greeks never sculpted people who are out of shape or who are ill, because every Greek sculpture looks, well, not every Greek sculpture, there's exceptions to everything, but most Greek sculptures, classical Greek sculptures, tend to look like superstar athletes because they wanted to show the human body at its most perfect, reaching its greatest potential. So here's a summary of the lost wax, but really the video is the best way to get an idea of how the lost wax work. This comes directly from your book, so if you want a closer look at this, it's in your text. So pushing beyond traditional methods, artists have found other ways to enliven sculpture that go beyond conventional additive and subtractive techniques. Earthworks, construction, assemblage, ready-made, kinetic and light sculptures, installation, and on and on and on and on. As you guys probably know by now, art can really be made with anything. It doesn't have to be limited to these traditional materials. Although a lot of traditional materials are still used because we know they work, we know they last. And some of the materials we'll be discussing aren't necessarily what we call archival. They don't necessarily have a long life. So earthworks and land art use the surface of the earth as material. Because of their enormous size, earthworks need the collaboration of many artists and workers. And many believe earthworks should represent a sense of harmony between nature and humanity. So, earthworks date back, to the ancients, right? Think of Stonehenge, right? And the rock circles of ancient England. Or we could use this example. This comes from Ohio. This was made by an ancient Native American people. It's called the Great Serpent Mound. It was made probably by hundreds, if not thousands, of workers taking dirt and mounding it together. This culture would not have had the wheel, it would not have had wagons, so it's very likely that things like clay pots and baskets would have been used to haul the materials. You can see it's the shape of a snake eating an egg. This probably had ceremonial purposes. It relates to the concept of life and death. predator and prey. Eggs represent birth. Snakes could represent death. It's the circle of life, guys. This is a very ancient kind of concept, and we see it here playing out in this large-scale mound. But we could look at other parts across the world and see, like, for example, in England, large-scale land art has existed for thousands of years. This, called the White Horse of Uffington, was created by pulling away the dirt and the grass from the surface of the earth and revealing the chalky soil underneath, creating this rather striking image. But modern artists also think about the earth as a kind of a source for artwork, as a material to be used to create images, to create art. Now, Robert Smithson belonged to a group of artists who referred to themselves as land artists or earthwork artists. We saw a work by his wife, Nancy Holt. We saw two works by his wife, Nancy Holt, earlier this semester. The work Sun Tunnels, and then the work at the Florida University using the sun. Her stuff often involves the movement of Earth and the sun and the planets and the stars together to create these sort of experiences. And he does something very similar. He creates Spiral Jetty, which is in the Great Salt Lake, and it is a massive, it's like you can see it, 1,500 feet. It's like, third of a mile or so, quarter of a mile long. It is massive. So why? Why a spiral? Well, for Smithson, first of all, Smithson wants to use art in harmony with nature. He's very much an environmentalist. He's very much an ecologist. And so this work is made to, ultimately, it will erode, it will decay, it will dissolve. Because he doesn't want to create anything permanent. He doesn't want to create anything that will resolve the earth, but instead bring our attention to it, but eventually go back to the earth. He uses the spiral shape because of ancient connotations. The spiral is found all over the world. It is found, as you can see in examples, in ancient Greece and China, Ireland. I could show you images from India, the Native America, all over the world. And in most cases, spirals represent water, the flow of water, the ebb and flow of the tides, etc. And water equates specifically with life. It is necessary, absolutely necessary for life. We can't have it without it. So this in a way refers to the kind of eternal symbol of water, but also it refers to the scientific makeup of water, because this is the Great Salt Lake in Utah, made up of salt crystals. And if you look at this image of the salt crystal here, examined through a high-powered microscope, you can see that the pattern formed inside the crystal is a spiral. And so Smithson is kind of bringing together these spiritual ideas of water, of life, of sort of the eternal birth and decay of nature, along with this kind of scientific view of water, that it is literally a spiral that forms the salt that makes up the water of the Great Salt Lake. I think that's pretty cool. Here are some more examples of some spirals. Construction uses a variety of methods to create and put together components. This is relatively new. This came about with the invention of mass-produced materials like mass-produced steel and glass and things like that. So just in the same way, a building can be constructed from pre-made parts, girders, and sheets of metal and glass. So too can sculpture be welded together or assembled in other ways, constructed basically to create an image. So in this image by Nam Gabo, we see the artist has taken various pieces of steel and welded them together to create a sculpture. There's unconventional materials. Damien Hirst is a British artist who deals with the unconventional, deals with the shocking. Damien Hirst came out of a movement of artists in the 1980s in Britain that were known collectively as the YBA, literally the Young British Artists. It's an acronym for. And these artists wanted to shake up. They were kind of young. They were influenced by punk rock music. They wanted to shock their audience. They wanted to also become rich and famous and make names for themselves. And they would do these outrageous stunts that literally shock the art world. And Damien Hirst, more than I think any of the others, created work that was incredibly shocking, and it was meant to be. And this is his Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. It is a shark cut into 3 sections and then put into 3 separate glass boxes and held in formaldehyde. This work of art was had to be remade, basically, because of the way the formaldehyde failed to preserve the shark. Damien Hirst replaced the shark. He sold the image. He sold the artwork. It started to cloud and decay, and he basically hired another fisherman to catch another shark, cut up that shark, and replaced it. So it's not even the original shark. It's really the idea that he was selling, not the material. So why did he do this, though? I mean, obviously he did it because it is shocking. It is something to see in real life. Just the kind of wow factor of this and the what the hell factor of this certainly is part of the reason. But also Damien Hirst art deals with a subject that a lot of art deals with, and that is the subject of death. And in this case, it's in the title, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. So what does that mean? We're confronted with this sort of apex predator, right? A shark. One of the oldest surviving creatures on the planet. A creature that sort of reached its perfect form, its final form, hundreds of millions of years ago, and it's been so successful it hasn't really evolved much beyond the form it reached a long time ago. And yet, even though this apex predator, which is one of the most feared creatures on the planet, which is a perfectly evolved killing machine, dies. And it is fragile, and ultimately it can succumb to the same things that we all will succumb to, which is death. And seeing something so powerful and so strong reduced literally to kind of an object, something that has been cut up and sliced and diced and put on display for our pleasure, is meant to, in a way, remind us of our own death. There's an old term, memento mori, a remembrance of death, that is common in art. You'll see pictures of skulls and things like that as a way of reminding us that we're going to die. And that is ultimately what this is. It is a memento mori. It is a reminder of our own immortality. And we're confronted with it when we see something so powerful reduced to this, not only this state of death, but this sort of object that is meant to sort of shock and titillate us. Assemblage. Assemblage is the practice of gathering objects and fabricating them into a work of art. This is a work by Betty Saar called The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. This was created for an exhibit in 1972, and Betty Saar, as an African-American artist, wanted to use some loaded images, wanted to use some images that have negative connotations. And in this case, she's using these images of African Americans that were meant to create negative stereotypes, and especially what is known as the mammy figure, a figure that is a sort of associated with African American enslavement. And you can see in this image we have this sort of mammy character standing with a broom holding a baby, which she is taking care of, and standing in a patch of cotton. So this, of course, all refers to the sort of antebellum South, the South before the war, when slavery was still legal. And these objects are not objects that she made, but these are objects that she found. These were kind of, objects that people would keep in their homes. Postcards and calendars and trinkets and things like that. And of course today this would be completely reprehensible, but this was not an uncommon practice back in the day. But you'll notice that she has added to these images. She's added a gun and she's added a fist, representing power, representing change, representing revolution. So she's telling this story with objects that already existed by assembling them into a new format that recontextualizes, that changes their meaning from an image of servitude and enslavement to an image of power and rebellion. So that leads us to artists who use objects that are already made. This was pioneered by an artist named Marcel Duchamp, who we'll talk a lot more about later on this semester. But he argued that when chosen and presented by an artist, any found object can become a work of art. So art isn't about how you make something, it's how it's presented. We use the term appropriation sometimes when the object is altered in a way that changes its original meaning or purpose. And that's what Betty Saar did with her image here, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. She appropriated these images and gave them a new context. So this is a ready-made made by Pablo Picasso. He took two objects already made, bicycle parts, so handlebars and a bicycle seat, and by reassembling them, he's created a new object, a bull's head out of these previously ready-made objects. Sometimes sculpture moves. We call this kinetic sculpture. So kinetic sculpture can move due to wind, it can move because of motors, but it moves. That is kinetic sculpture. Light sculpture. Artists, since the earliest days of electricity, started to experiment with electric light. And one of those pioneers is a guy named Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Moholy-Nagy is an artist who created these bizarre machines that use light and mirrors and metal parts to create patterns and reflections. And in many ways, he was sort of anticipating multimedia design that we see all the time today. You go to big concerts and you watch performances, music performances on TV, and you see the use of screens and electronics and projected lights and lasers to create this sort of spectacular environment. And Moholy-Nagy didn't have that technology. He had simple sort of mechanical parts and small motors and rather not very powerful light bulbs. But he wanted to create these environments that would be filled with moving light and sound and shapes in a way that we can easily accomplish today with digital projections and lasers. But he was doing this stuff, in the late 1920s, early 1930s, really kind of pioneering sort of multimedia installations. And now, of course, we see this kind of stuff all the time, as we can see in Athena Touch's Star Fountain, where you can see her use of light. Let's zoom here. To create a kind of kinetic experience for the viewer as they watch things change. Installations involve the construction of a space or the assembly of objects to create an environment. We're encouraged to experience the work physically using all our senses, perhaps by entering the work itself. So an installation is a work that it is a space that has been altered. It can be a room, it can be a gallery, it can be an entire outdoor area. The idea, though, is you are transforming a space to create an experience for the viewer. This is Anthony Gormley, a British artist who created a massive work called Asian Field. He did this by going to different places in China and giving locals clay. And these people would make sculptures out of these clay that were meant to be kind of evoke self-portraits. And then he assembled them together in an old abandoned steelworks factory in China and created over 200,000 of these figures. And so, in a way, you're supposed to be kind of overwhelmed by the sense of community that he has created, because each one of these figures was made by a different person. And these people lived, all over and did not necessarily have anything to do with each other or knew each other or communicated with each other. And yet they are brought together in this sort of communal space through Gormley's work. And so you're not just meant to be overwhelmed by the massiveness of this installation, which of course it is overwhelming, but also you're supposed to be overwhelmed by the fact that you are looking at the work of hundreds of thousands of people who have no real connection with each other except the fact that they've all participated in this work of art. And it is through art that we can connect with each other. We can become a community, I think, is what this artwork is really about. All right, guys, so that's it. Have a good rest of your day, and I will see you in the next lecture.